We are now going to look at the matter of professional ethics. This is really the introduction to this topic, and in other courses we'll be taking this question of ethical behaviour for property people a little bit further. First thing I'd like you to do is go to the API website and download and read their Code of Professional Conduct. You'll find that in it they tell members that members must carry out their professional duties ethically, and a number of other things, all to do with behaving the proper way. This leaves us with a question about what exactly does ethics mean? If we're going to be ethical, we've got to understand what this ethics business means. It turns out that ethics is something that everyone likes to talk about. Most people think that they are ethical, but when it comes down to hard definitions and actually looking what the requirements of ethics are, it is something quite different. The API goes on to talk about acting with good faith and acting without personal bias. It also refers to the values and reputation of the profession. These things all make sense, but what exactly do they mean? This is what we really need to have a closer look at, especially when we go further through the Code of Professional Conduct, and we find that issues like keeping the confidence of clients or threatening to lessen the confidence of clients or the public in the institute or the profession is important. The confidence of clients or the confidence of the community really has to do with trust, and so we have to give some thought to what trust means. Now, most of us have been using these words for a long time, but when it comes down to it, we find there are a lot of people who like to say they're trustworthy or say they're ethical, while in fact they might be doing something the equivalent of stabbing you in the back. We have to find out what it means to do these things. In the second section of the Code of Professional Conduct, we find discussion about conflict of interest. And this is where the question of interest becomes important, and especially when we look at the relationship between a valuer and his client or her client as being an interpersonal relationship, given that people all have their own personal objectives and interests, and somehow we're being asked, not told or forced, somehow there is something in being a professional which means we have to make a personal choice not to let our interest get in the way of our clients. How do we measure that, and why should we follow it? To begin with, we need to ask ourselves, what exactly is a code of ethics? What are ethics? To understand that, we can go back to some fairly simple definitions. A moral is a principle for the appropriate relations between persons. That's fairly straightforward. One way or another, just about all human interaction is based on appropriate or inappropriate relations. So if someone comes up to you and you give them some money, it might be because they've got a gun pointed at you, in which case it's an inappropriate way to take money from you. On the other hand, they might be taking your money because they've just given you some good or service which is worth the money that you've paid for, in which case it's appropriate. All of our interactions, one way or another, can be measured against appropriateness or inappropriateness. Some of them are merely tastes. For instance, our manners, or how we show our appreciation for a good meal, might change with culture. However, there are some fundamental things that don't seem to change with culture. For instance, there is no viable culture that is known to history where things like the cold-blooded killing of innocent people is considered to be an appropriate way for people to relate. We call that murder. Moving on, while we have morals as these principles for appropriate relations, we can now define ethics, because an ethic is a set of morals. And what we're really doing here is looking at that set of morals which is particular to a property professional, and specifically a property valuer. We've seen that while morals are freely adopted principles, the profession uses a code of ethics because it expects its members to freely choose to follow the client's best interests. It also expects professionals who effectively have a power that the rest of the community doesn't have. As a valuer, you understand property value and you have access to the strategies, the approaches, the methods, the resources to work out property value in a way that the community can't. That really constitutes a power that the average person in the street doesn't have. It's a matter of how you choose to use that power, whether it's for your own interest or the interest of your client. The API asks for its members to act ethically, and if they don't, they risk being expelled from the institution. That's really the only thing that's going to happen, unless you do something really, really naughty, in which case you might find yourself on criminal charges. We can ask ourselves, are these sanctions, these punishments, these threats done by the professional community through the API or the civil community through the legal system actually sufficient to curb our behaviour? If they were totally sufficient, we would not have to bother too much about training people in ethics, because they would simply do the right thing. However, we have ample example of people from time to time not doing the right thing, not acting ethically, especially in the professions. And so we can raise a question mark over the issue of whether the sanctions are sufficient. Do they actually cause the results that we want? And that's something that I don't know if I can actually answer in a short presentation. We can, though, move on and ask ourselves, what is the ideal source of compliance? By that I mean, what is the ideal way to get a professional to actually act in a way which is consistent with the code of ethics, the code of conduct? I could stand up and say you'll make more money by being ethical. That's tantamount to saying that your interests are actually to be ethical. And there's a certain merit in that. Certainly someone who is known to be ethical will probably get more business. But in the end of the day, what does that say about the question of conflicts of interests? Because really what I'm saying is that being ethical ultimately means that you're putting your interests before your clients, and if you discover some better way of making money, why not do that? And so the argument or using self-interest as a source of compliance sounds rather hollow when you look at it a little bit closer. And then we can come down to the question of, where do ethics come from? Where do we find these sets of morals? And in fact, where do we find these principles for appropriate relations? And how do we know which ones are worth keeping? These are all important questions. What this means is that we can at least leave our superficial reading of the API's code of conduct with probably more questions than we began. We can ask ourselves, what are the types of ethical systems? Which ethical system should I follow? Are there classes or different categories of ethical systems? Are there good ethical systems and bad ethical systems? Well, in a sense, that's almost going around in circles. What we can find is that there are really two different categories of ethical systems: objective ethics versus subjective ethics. And we'll look at that in a different presentation. We can also test the question of ethics by looking at the relationship between ethics and society. How do ethical systems affect society? And so what kind of a society would you prefer to operate in? One which is operating well as a result of its ethical choices, or one which is not operating so well? That's an issue. A third general question is looking into the question of what do you need to have an objective set of ethics? And we're going to be looking at questions of objective knowledge and the whole conception of truth. A fourth question is the question of how the sanctions work. How does freedom and coercion fit into the question of ethics? And the final point that we come after looking at the requirement to act ethically to stay in the API is an understanding of what the human person really is. That stands behind our notions of society, which are really collections of human persons, and see how that fits with ethical preferences. We'll attempt these issues in separate presentations now. A couple of them we're going to set as core, and the remainder will be left as extension activities for you.